Welcome to Just Champions, a podcast by Equitas, which focuses on the prosecution of sexual violence, domestic violence, stalking, and trafficking from the perspective of the prosecutors who handle these cases, the allied professionals with whom they collaborate, and the victims and communities that they serve. I'm Jennifer Long, the CEO and co-founder of Equitas, and a former prosecutor specializing in adult and child sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, stalking, and sexual exploitation. And this is the inaugural season of Just Champions, where we will explore the ways prosecutors can influence justice and safety through the lens of our guests who impacted safety and justice for victims in ways you may not expect. In this episode, I'm joined by Kristen Gibbons Feden, who is currently a shareholder at the firm Anapol Weiss and formerly an assistant district attorney in the Montgomery County, Pennsylvania DA's office. Kristen, hello. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm very excited about getting the chance to have this conversation with you.
I am more excited to even have a conversation with you.
And full disclosure, Kristen Gibbons Feden is a board member of Equitas and is really a powerhouse in the legal community, was a powerhouse as a prosecutor and such a committed champion sexual violence. And so thank you for joining us and just talking about your experience in prosecution. And thank you for coming here and spending the day with us, spending some time with us, not quite the day.
It is my pleasure. It is my pleasure.
Great. So I have started these conversations by asking everyone to talk about their career and how you became a prosecutor, how you decided to become a prosecutor.
Yeah. So Jen, I built my career on kind of merging some of the passions that I had from youth. I have a passion for justice with a deep commitment to standing up for survivors of sexual abuse and other forms of violence, which makes why I love serving on the board of Equitas, right? Which deals specifically with gender-based violence. But as you know, you don't come out of the womb kind of just having that as your passion. I developed my passion for law because my dad always said, you need to go to law school. You are debating me way too much. We need to stop.
I have one of those at home.
Yeah, exactly. I know your parents said that too.
No, one now. I have one now at home. A debater.
Sorry. No. I am as well. But that's where I began my passion for law. And I really did not see my passion for representing survivors of sexual abuse and more specifically spending my career dealing with gender-based violence until my first year internship at the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, where I was thankful and lucky enough to be assigned to the family violence unit. And it was there where I had the opportunity to really see survivors and really get a rewarding sense of providing them with justice, providing them with a voice. And again, I was just a first year at that point, but to see the prosecutors and see the impact that they had on these young children, some adult, on their lives was so profound. So that's where I grew to love prosecutorial work. And although I started my legal career as an intern, a judicial law clerk, with the Montgomery County Court of Common Pleas with Judge Page, I quickly transitioned into the prosecutor's office in Montgomery County.
Wow. So, and I don't think I realized you were a clerk. So was it a trial clerk? Is it a trial clerk position when you're in the common pleas court?
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting because during the time that I graduated, 2009, there was an economic crisis. And so the government and governmental jobs were not really hiring.
Yep.
And I was fortunate enough to get this particular job because all my internships were with the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. I was fortunate enough to get this job because he was a brand new judge. So he had just got elected in 2009, which is the year I graduated. And he was beginning on the bench in January. And I started with him in January of 2010.
Wow. And so did any of that influence you deciding, yes, for sure, I definitely want to I want to go into prosecution.
Absolutely. So he actually sat on the civil bench when he
Okay.
first started. So I got an exploration of civil law, but it never took me away from the love and passion that I had for criminal law, which I spent my summers doing. And so when he moved over to the criminal bench, it was all reaffirmed for me. I got to see him preside over, and I obviously gave him analytical and legal research opinions on different criminal cases, different suppression motions, and we dealt with homicides, sexual violence, and other types of gender-based violence as well.
So
Um,
that's really interesting because, we, and in the civil, and we'll get to the full arc of your career, but I think, I'm not a civil attorney, but the burden on civil is a lesser burden than criminal. And so it's interesting. You had that internship experience from the Family Violence Sexual Assault Unit and then coming in as a clerk in the courtroom.
that's great.
Did that influence you at all, or did that help you at all, I guess I should say, in your clerkship?
Absolutely. And here's why, because prosecutors, we spend probably, and you know this, Jen, 90% of our time in the courtroom.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that is really attractive about the prosecutorial career is you're always speaking before judges, but most importantly, you represent the Commonwealth. So as a prosecutor, you are not only making sure that um, the constitutional laws are being adhered to by anyone on the governmental end, such as law enforcement or prosecutors, but you're also trying to build a very clean record. So you want to make sure that the defendant, whoever he or she may be or they may be, is being zealously advocated on their side. But then you also have your own job to do, which is to make sure that the streets stay safe. And so you have a wide ranging role as a prosecutor. And that's something that I got to see firsthand before I joined the prosecutorial office, which was reaffirming for me. But it was also very telling because it was very interesting to see that lens.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that's fascinating. Fascinating. And it's interesting too. I'm thinking, so you interned in the Philadelphia DA's office with the Family Violence Sexual Assault Unit, and then you ended up working in Montgomery County. And I guess the first thing, I mean, it is sort of interesting. Not another big county, I mean, because it's right outside of Philadelphia, but are they set up the same? Are there special units in each one, or was it a different situation? How did that work out what was the layout when you started?
Yeah, it was very different because the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, even though Montgomery County is a very large county, the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office is way larger.
Okay.
And so I think, and I never worked in the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, but I did spend 2 summers there, all of my, legal summers there. So what I do know is that, what I do believe is that in Montgomery County, the way that we broke things up so that we made sure that prosecutors had the skills that were necessary before they were sent into very serious trials. And again, I'm not trying to minimize or maximize any type of crime.
Right.
All crimes are horrific. But what they did was they started in Montgomery County, we start you in the pretrial unit.
Hmm.
And that way you get to argue motions, you get to argue discovery motions, you get to argue, you get to analyze the case and make sure all of the documents that the defense should have because of Brady are appropriately turned over. You also handle summary appeals, which we kind of know in everyday language as, traffic incidents, but
Yep.
that sharpens your trial skills.
Yep.
Once you built that competence, then they move you into the juvenile unit. And as you know, Jen, in Pennsylvania, juvenile trials are all bench trials, which means
Yep.
that it's only a judge presides over. And so there's no jury. Um, and so you get to make sure that you learn those trial skills, just really speaking to the court as the fact finder. And so that is really crucial as to the next step of your trial litigation stage. But all throughout, both in the pretrial as well as in the juvenile departments that you're working in, you are dealing firsthand with victims, survivors, defendants, opposing counsel, and judges, all of which build the foundation to allow you then, once you deal with adult crimes, which some are jury trials, some are bench trials, and some are going to plead out, but it allows you to build up the ability and trial skills necessary to really competently do that case. But more importantly, Jen, and I think this is the most crucial characteristic for a prosecutor, you build up that judgment, right?
Yes.
To be able to look at a case and not just see a file and a name,
Yep.
but you see a survivor, but you also see a defendant who may
Yep.
have some mitigating, qualities that should be considered when fashioning a fair sentence or penalty or rehabilitation result.
Yeah, I really love that you brought that up because I think that's always the thing that I love about prosecution, and I know that that may not be the narrative these days right now, but as the pro and again, you can't generalize. Obviously, there's good and bad of everything, but the prosecutor's really in there, and our duty is not only to achieve justice and to what are the show we can have hard blows but not foul ones, ensure innocence does not suffer, guilt does not escape, but that you're also there to ensure due process. And
Right,
so the role of that person in the courtroom, the defense has a role of zealous advocacy for the defendant, and the judge has a role of really understanding fair application of the law and making rulings, and up until sentencing. And for the prosecutors, I just always appreciated that role. And yeah, Philly was, similar in that they tried to give you experience and really let you stand on your own on cases where there's less witness contact in the beginning. In Philly, we have that robust MC
yes.
system where, at least when I was there, you have the, trial, the appeal by right, because they're not jury trials in front of the judge. And so maybe they'd give you possession drug cases. They give you the opportunity. Again, they want you arguing motions, doing preliminary hearings where there can be, if there are errors made, you've got someone there, and they can be fixed. And but they wanted to build up in you that judgment again, and that ability to stand on your own and be compassionate before
Right.
you're interacting with victims of these serious crimes, and of any victims in the community.
That's right.
So it's hard to get into the sexual violence. I mean, it's funny. It's a love. Sometimes, so I don't know how the judges were in Montgomery County. Sometimes they were always, a little impatient with the sexual violence, domestic violence dockets, and the human trafficking. I would say unfairly impatient, but I know
Mhm.
it's, those are coveted spots. Tell me how you got to focus on sexual violence, domestic violence, I think stalking, human trafficking. Tell me how you got to do that in Montgomery County.
Yeah, it's interesting because in Montgomery County, because it's smaller than Philadelphia, once you got into the adult trial division, it really was based on where there was a vacancy, if you
Hmm.
will. But they also looked at what skills and what type of trials you did in the juvenile department. And it just so happened there wasn't a lot of movement during the time I was in the juvenile unit. And so I spent a significant period of time in the juvenile unit.
Hmm.
And as you may recall, in the juvenile unit, pretty much all of the cases are trials.
Right, right,
And that's, because juveniles, they don't go to jail. They may get placement, but they're
right.
rehabilitative. And so it makes sense for there to be trials just because at the end of the day, the defense attorney says, all right, well, my client's not going to go to jail. Yes, they may go to placement, but we have a colorable argument. We're going to try this case.
Yes.
So as a result, I tried unfortunately, a lot of cases dealing with gender-based violence.
Hmm.
Not so much human trafficking at that
Hmm.
level, because again, the defendant in that unit is always a child.
Yep.
Not to say that children can't traffic,
Right.
but, if there was a human trafficking element, it was usually the survivor who was the trafficked,
Right.
victim. And so we didn't see a lot of that there, but there unfortunately was a lot of abuse within the familial
Yep.
unit, as well as abuse within, if they were in a residential facility, they were sexually preyed upon by another child or something along that nature. And so unfortunately, there was a lot of that. And so I did, learn a lot about how to prosecute gender-based violence. Again, the extent of gender-based violence in terms of physical, domestic violence, intimate partner violence was not as prevalent as it was in the adult world, but
Hmm.
there was some cases where
Yeah.
children experienced gender-based violence in high school. That was typically the age group. But as a result, when a person left and there was a vacancy in the adult unit and it was time for me to quote unquote graduate out of the juvenile division, um, I was fortunate enough to go into the sexual violence unit because I had those skills. I had tried several cases dealing with gender-based violence, sexual violence. Um, and, you know, at that time, there was really two vacancies that needed to be filled with one person.
Mhm.
One was that of, the sex crimes team is what we called it
Yep.
at that point. But then we also knew that the elder abuse unit was also going to be unstaffed, and they asked me to be the chief of the elder abuse unit at that time as well.
Wow. That's incredible. And I think people do forget it's, and in just your explanation right now, you've really talked about the arc of sexual and gender based violence, right? I mean, it is from the youngest victims with young perpetrators who can really cause some harm. It's, really trying to untangle those cases. It just gives you an appreciation. And I, like you, I mean, in many ways, we did the juvenile rotation too. And there is some hope for rehabilitation. There's hope of trying to address something, but I think it's jarring. And then all the way up to the elder abuse, where again, you have sexual, gender based violence, the financial crimes, the
Mhm.
different abuse by intrafamilial abuse. And you have victims, the same issues come up, right? Credibility. Oh, they're young, so they're too young to know. They're old, so they're too old to know what has happened to them, and the extreme vulnerabilities, especially when you're in
Right.
facilities. So I mean, your time as a prosecutor, you really to have, I think they call it abuse across the lifespan. And I think your career is actually did that right at an early start, at an
Yeah.
early part. And did you find it helped? I always thought in the family violence unit, I know you were an intern there. I was a DA in Philly in the family violence unit. And we addressed the elder abuse there, although we did have attorneys that were focused on those crimes, although we would have some of those cases too in the unit, but we would be able to handle them. But we had everything from the child sexual and physical abuse with the adult perpetrators, domestic violence, adult sexual violence, exploitation, elder abuse. And like you, I mean, I was there earlier than you were, but like you, it was missed when we saw it. We were cobbling together, probably not great laws. So,
Mhm, mhm.
but in any way, I felt like handling those cases, even though the dynamics can be unique, it helped you sometimes to do one case with a victim. Then you would take something you learned into the other case, which might have very unique dynamics. Did you find that? Can you talk a little bit about
Absolutely.
that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting you say that because, yeah, that is the key, I think, to a great trial attorney and more importantly, to a great prosecutor, to always go back and reflect upon what could I have done better in this case, even if there's a guilty verdict. What could I have done better for the survivor? Because at
Mhm.
the end of the day, yes, a survivor wants there to be an arrest. They want the perpetrator to be held accountable, and they want a guilty verdict. But at the end of that prosecution, the prosecutor picks up another file and continues on, but that survivor still lives with that pain.
Right.
Um, so one of the things I kind of learned as I started progressing on, and this is, I think, extremely important for gender-based violence, is building the rapport early. And that was one of the things that we would do in the Montgomery County District Attorney's Office is we began, and I can't recall if we did this from the start, but at a certain point in my career, while I was in the sex crimes team, what we did was we took people-centric crimes and we began to follow the police wherever they may be within the county. And we made sure that we made contact with that individual from the start, starting before even arrest at some points, or even at the preliminary hearing, and making sure that we were there and we kept the case, regardless of what judge it went to within the county, so that that survivor would have that same prosecutor wouldn't have to relearn someone's name and have to retell their trauma. It just, I think, helped along the way. That was one thing that I think was, one way that we took problems of the past and fix them for the future. But in addition to that, we made sure that we became more trauma informed. That was something that was somewhat of a newer phenomenon as
Yeah.
well, and began to do that. Then when I was there as well, one of the new things that was coming out, and I know this is like a little bit old news now, is vicarious trauma.
Yeah.
Making sure that, and this was something I was very fortunate when I was in the sex crimes unit in the prosecutor's office. There was two other young ladies there, one of which is still a prosecutor and one of which is now a Title IX coordinator. And we would be able to say, listen, I can't do this anymore. Can you take this call? Can you do, I got this trial for you, or something along that nature, so that we made sure that any vicarious trauma that it was being dealt with. Because at the end of the day, one of the common threads and themes that I'd like to kind of lead my prosecution when I was a prosecutor is, if that were me, if that survivor or defendant
Yeah.
were me, my mom, my sister, my brother, I would want that prosecutor, that defense attorney, that judge, whatever, to give that person this type of respect and human dignity and time and attention as if they were the only case in the world. And
Yeah.
that's what we try to do. And, when you get broken down by vicarious trauma or overloading with work, you can't do that. It's just physically, in my opinion, impossible. So having a good network and recognizing that these traumas exist within prosecutors and probably within every single profession,
Yes.
and being able to resolve it, I think, was one of the things that we also worked on that was tremendous.
No, I think that's fantastic. I'm so glad you mentioned that too, because I think prosecutors are notorious, even in this time of self-care, for sort of pushing it down. And, obviously, we both know when you have a trial to do, you are compartmentalizing, you're compassionate. So you're letting it in. It's not like you're a robot, but you're trying not to break down, because you're really seeing the horror of humanity
You
in
are.
terms of the trust that they're betraying and the just horrific violence that they are enacting on another human being.
I
And so
agree.
sometimes you're right, you can't let that in. But I love that you're saying it, because it's important. We have to, as humans, you're going on to interact with others. And for the victims, they need
That's
you to
right.
be strong and healed. No, I love that. So, and in the arc of your career, I feel like, and in your trial practice, in the crimes you're handling, have come across every type of rape myth that's out there, the unfair credibility, opinions that are made of victims. What are some of the most common biases that you were facing, and how did you overcome them? How did you learn to overcome them at trial?
Yeah, so I have to, if you don't mind, Jen, I have to take this time, and I know you didn't plan this, but give a shout out to Equitas. One of the things as a prosecutor in, focusing directly on sexual violence that we've always had to overcome were exactly what you said, rape myths. And what rape myths do, particularly as a prosecutor, which makes it really difficult to prosecute sexual violent crimes, is you have to basically, because you have a burden beyond a reasonable doubt. But there are so many things, like, our survivors do not come in at a level playing field of credibility. They don't have the opportunity to get on the stand and have a fact finder, whether it be a jury or a judge, say, all right, I'm just going to take this person as they are. Oh, you know what? They're not making eye contact with me. Let me downgrade their credibility. Oh, they gave it inconsistently. See, let me downgrade their credibility. No, a lot of times that victim's credibility is shot at before they take the stand. Why? Well, because there's opening statements where there may be, and this goes to the answer to your question, what are some of the rape myths that we see, where the survivor did not go to the police right after he or she or they were raped, where the survivor remained in contact with the offender, where they may have given inconsequential inconsistencies because of the cognitive dissonance. They may have done so many other things. They may have voluntarily ingested an intoxicant, because every college person, most,
Right.
I shouldn't say every, drinks alcohol. It
Right.
just is what it is.
Right. There's no
It's
crime in drinking.
so,
Well, I mean, underage, but
well, you know what I mean.
the natural consequence of drinking alcohol is not rape. Right.
Maybe a lot of other things, but not that.
Right. Or they may have worn something that they thought was cute, but for some strange rapist, he thinks that that's an invitation. So a lot of times when survivors get on the stand, their credibility has already been downgraded to the point where a lot of times people are not listening. And so throughout the trial, prosecutors have not only a job to make sure that they prove the crime beyond a reasonable doubt, specifically the rape, the domestic violence situation, the whatever it may be, but they also have to prove, and this is with every case, the credibility of the survivor. And for gender-based violence, I find it is an uphill battle because of the downgrades that person has taken before they even get on the stand because of these rape myths. And the reason, Jen, that I gave a shout out to Equitas is because for a while, and you can correct me on the history, Pennsylvania was not allowed to call an expert in the dynamics of sexual abuse. What does that mean? Well, I, as a prosecutor, had to explain to the jury, oh, no, 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 no. Just because that person didn't go to the police right away doesn't mean that they are lying. It means that they were afraid. And I would do that anyway. But now I have someone who is not on the prosecution side, who is not on the defense side, who is seen as a quote unquote blind witness. In other words, they're not talking about the case. They don't know anything about the case, but what they do know is the dynamics of sexual abuse. And a judge, because it is statutory, has to tell that jury, it's not discretionary, has to tell that jury, this is an expert in the dynamics of sexual abuse. And now I have someone who is an expert deemed by the court to tell the fact finder, hey, delayed disclosure is the norm, not the exception.
Yeah.
Hey, there is a phenomena called cognitive dissonance. And this is why there may be some inconsistencies in statement. When a question is posed, that may not be the most substantial thing that they're thinking of. So it's not that they're lying. It more or less is because at that point, they're ready to disclose what they're ready to disclose. And that is normal. Doesn't mean it's a lie. They are able to tell the fact finder, hey, the survivor staying in contact with the defendant or the perpetrator is actually the norm, not the exception. Why? Oh, well, because sometimes there's a power dynamic. There's normalization. There's all of these things that you and I both know because we work in gender-based violence, but, reasonably, the average juror may not know. Yeah. And so the reason I gave Equitas that shout out is because not only were you guys instrumental in making sure that legislation was brought to Pennsylvania, but then you guys did the extra step. As a prosecutor's resource, you guys recognized that prosecutors, I know myself, have no money to pay for training. And you recognize that not only do prosecutors have no money to pay for training, but the office's budgets are pretty small. And so you guys not only offered a training free of charge, but you also paid for travel and hotel. And the thing that I thought was so beautiful is that when that new legislation came in, you guys invited people from all of the offices and said, hey, bring a therapist with you. So I was so fortunate enough to have one of our advocates from our local nonprofit Victim Services Center of Norristown. And she and I jumped in a car and we rode to Penn State, I think it was, where the training was. And we learned about the legislation that you guys were instrumental in putting on. We learned about Equitas as a prosecutor's resource. So not only do you offer these free trainings, but you guys are a consistent stream that I can, and I utilize throughout my prosecutorial career. Hey, Terry, or hey, Jen, hey, everybody. Have you guys had this case before? Is there any law? Have you done this briefing? And was able to rely upon you because I have a mountain of cases. And I was able to rely on your expertise, and I wasn't the lone fish in that water surrounded by sharks. I was now the shark who was able to, fight back, not alone. And so that's why I have to give Equitas so many props, because when it came to rape myths. You guys were not only on the forefront of making sure that legislation allowed experts to be called in these cases, but you didn't stop there. You trained prosecutors how to question an expert, how to elicit testimony. You trained experts how to give that testimony. You trained law enforcement, but you also went that extra step. So I have to give Equitas a shout out. I know you didn't ask for it, but I must do it.
No, I love it. And I give a shout out to P. I mean, this is when we were under what Pennsylvania Coalition
Oh,
Against
yeah.
Rape. I guess they're at advanced respect now in terms of so supportive. And we always feel like they're they were able to sometimes push legislation through and we're able to do the path through. But we had, as you said, I mean, especially as a Pennsylvania attorney, having a prosecutor having to operate in a universe where you were stuck with incoming from, okay, there might have been some defense attorneys who really didn't know the dynamics and truly believed what they were seeing was evidence of lack of credibility. But you and I both know the frequent flyers in there, they knew exactly
Yeah.
what they were doing. And
That's
those poor and so before we were stuck with argument telling people, because the defense when they got up there to make their opening, they either said or implied, you're going to know this didn't happen because you're going to hear that the victim did XYZ, and that's not what a real victim does.
That's right.
And so you're right, this expert testimony allows just the leveling of the playing field so that they can actually listen. And I now have to give a shout out to one of our attorney advisors, John Kurland, who was the the DA in Berks County, who argued the appeal to the Supreme Court to uphold the constitutionality of it. And, obviously, thank you across the state goes. But I mean, I was like you, I practiced in the same place. And you do. I mean, we could go on and on as we have. So on victim behavior, but it's funny. That's exactly what I thought. I thought you were talking about because it was very instrumental and it's so unfair. Obviously, credibility, of course, people have to assess credibility. Of course, we want truthfulness, but unfair attacks based on the quote unquote common sense, it's not common sense at all. It's just piling on to a victim and blaming them for every single thing that happened to them is just, it's just not right. And so, I mean, kudos to you because I know you've used it. And again, the training, I mean, it's so important for us to do. And a lot of our trainings are, funded by the Department of Justice, who's funding this podcast right now. So the Office on Violence Against Women. So shout out to them because, for prosecutors, we representing the people, but we're amplifying the voice. We're trying to protect survivors and get justice and prevent things from happening again.
That's right.
You kind of talked about, are there any other laws or rules of evidence that you come up that actually might be, I don't want to say fun, maybe they're horrifying to have to deal with in these cases, or, you kind of like to have to make the arguments that are coming up in that sexual violence, domestic violence, stalking world?
Yeah. So always rape shield.
Yeah.
Right. We
Want to
always
talk about that a little bit? I mean, I know we've got some, I'm not sure the range of people who might be listening, just a little bit of what Rape Shield is.
Yeah. So Rape Shield is basically, and it would differ per state. But I think overall it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Rape Shield is exactly what it sounds like. It allows a shield for the survivor to hide behind so that when an individual is accused of rape, that defense attorney can't say, oh, well, you had sex with Johnny yesterday and Milton that day and this person. No. The only thing the rape shield allows is for that particular sexual encounter and any prior consensual sexual encounters with only that perpetrator. And so if, for in fact, I've prosecuted cases where the survivor in that case was a prostitute. Well, ding dong, just because you are a prostitute doesn't make, you a target or an invitation to be sexually preyed upon by any old person.
Oh my gosh. I know the violence against sexually exploited women. And in Philly, actually did one of the oldest studies in the 90s of what happens to them and how. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I'm like, oh my gosh. And you have another state, there's a state appeal that went up on Rogers that was trying to introduce prostitution related convictions in rape cases, again, to unfairly attack. It was, the rape shield was upheld in the right way, but I didn't mean to interrupt, but yes, you put them one of the most vulnerable victims, and it's without shield, and they're shields of irrelevant information because it isn't relevant.
It isn't. It
And
doesn't matter. And that's the thing, it's unfortunately, even with Rape Shield, I found myself still arguing, even though it's statutory. The fact that this person had consensual intercourse and I even actually just recently argued it and it was different because Rape Shield, it acts differently in the civil litigation realm. But from just a relevancy standpoint, if a person had oral sexual intercourse consensually with an individual and then an hour later is raped by another individual, the fact that she engaged in that consensual sexual intercourse has no bearing on whether the perpetrator did it or not, or any bearing on his guilt or innocence or liability or lack thereof.
oh
And
yeah.
so at the end of the day, it makes no sense why we need it as a statute, but we do. And
Right. We
thankfully
do,
thankful
right.
that
For
we do.
exact that reason that people will try to bring it in and they'll try to argue why it's relevant. But what they're really
Exactly.
saying is she doesn't deserve your justice. Don't
That's
believe her.
right.
And if you do believe her, does she really deserve it? That's the underlying tone that I have always had a chip on my shoulder against, and which I love because you fight the fight. And you're right. So now you are in civil litigation and award winning, I might tell everybody listening, a trial attorney. So you made that move. Tell me how you made the move and how prosecution like your experience in prosecution impacted at all your ability to work in the civil realm.
Yeah. So I made the move, I want to say 5.5 or so years in my prosecutorial career. But interestingly, when I made the move, it was a difficult move, Jen, because I loved what I did. At that point, I was the chief of the elder abuse unit.
Wow.
I was also the chief of domestic violence at that time, before we changed the name to intimate partner violence. And now they have the whole family violence unit and it all falls into that umbrella. But when I was there, it was like different units. But when I made the jump, one thing I knew just from a career standpoint is I did not want to do defense work.
Hmm.
I'm glad there are phenomenal attorneys who do defense work, but it was just not something I was passionate about. So, I was able to parlay into investigatory work, employment and labor. So I would do investigations very similar to what I did as a prosecutor.
Yeah.
And I was also able to represent survivors in the civil litigation realm. And I thought that was so useful because I got to basically do what I did as a prosecutor, which I felt I provided a voice for those who had tried to be silenced. I helped them find their justice. And I was able to impact the lives of individuals who, I was really passionate about working with.
Yeah.
So now I do mostly crime victim work, which means I represent, survivors of crime, any type of crime in the civil realm. And I try to obtain civil justice for them. And what that kind of looks like is not just compensation, but it also results in policy changes, changing how organizations maybe screen employers, making sure that they don't hire someone because they failed to run a background check in a different state. So I'm able to kind of do those things, but from a civil litigation realm.
I mean, and I love how you say that. I think sometimes there's this like suspicion around the civil actions, and people have to remember there's true financial harm that befalls a victim, and the restitution that's available through through criminal court system, whether you have a perpetrator that even has the means to pay, and
Right.
what the limits are, it just doesn't compensate for people who've had a total, maybe have had to step back from work, the trauma, the therapy, other medical issues that they may have.
Right.
And the policy changes, which you say, which are so important because it does take an outside view to push organizations. If something is just internal, even when the will is there, it's not quite the same because you have a dual responsibility. You're thinking about the benefit of the organization and then the harm that happened. Whereas when you're on the outside, you're really able to exact the change that's needed. We're so
That's
proud
right.
of you. I'm like, we're so proud of you. I know. I would feel so condescending. I say it, but it's like when you're a board member, and I'm like, oh my gosh, we get to like be with you. I think I said this to Dahlia too, because she works for us and now she's I elected every time I
I
get
know,
someone
she's
who's
like a DA now. I
I know
always
I'm
love
going to
that.
have Nancy who was, I'm like people
I
who are
know.
connected to us.
But
We're very
that is a testament to you, Jen, and a testament to Equitas overall. Like, I'm not a prosecutor anymore, but I want to give back to the organization that made me a better prosecutor for the county that I live in and raise my kids in,
I love
and so many people have that same story on our board.
I mean, I love it. And I guess the last question I'll ask is, would you encourage law students to pursue prosecution and to maybe pursue prosecution of the crimes we cover, the sexual violence, domestic violence, the child abuse, stalking, trafficking?
Absolutely. Not only would I, but I do. I encourage law students all the time because I do a lot of mentoring. And I not only would encourage them into prosecution, but I would also encourage them into, as you mentioned, prosecuting these types of crime, gender-based violence. Because not only are these cases extremely rewarding, but you really are, in my view, on the front lines of justice. You know what I mean? You're protecting, as we talked about very early in the segment, um, protecting some of the most vulnerable because you are protecting children who are sexually abused by their parents. You are protecting mothers who are trying to mother their children. You're protecting them from their spouse. You're protecting little boys who may be sexually abused by their father. You're protecting men who are sometimes stigmatized if they come forward and say, hey, my spouse is sexually abusing me, or my spouse is physically abusing me. You are being able to be at the front lines of justice, breaking down all stigmas and barriers. And I really think that that is a privilege to be a part of, but it also shapes my view, makes me more sensitive and understanding. And I think it helps to shape the next generation of legal advocates.
With that mic drop, I can't think of a, I mean, I can't think of a better way to end this. So I'm just going to say thank you. I mean, I 100%, I'm 100% agree. Obviously, I'm biased. I think it's a great profession. And I cannot thank you enough for spending time with us today to go through the arc of your really interesting path into prosecution and then the way it's taken you. I just think it's been very valuable to just see the different ways that prosecution can impact a legal career. And thank you for all of your work on behalf of justice and on behalf of survivors. You're truly one of a kind.
Right back at you.
Thank you, Kristen.